The sun beat down mercilessly on Duncan Everett's neck as his horse picked its way across the Nebraska prairie, and he was about to turn toward the creek for water when he spotted what looked like a bundle of cloth lying motionless in the tall grass about 50 yards ahead. Duncan had been riding the open range for 2 weeks now, driving a small herd of cattle toward Twin Falls where he planned to sell them before winter set in. It was September of 1882, and the prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, golden and swaying in the hot wind. He'd seen plenty of strange things out here over the years, but something about this particular sight made his gut tighten with concern. As he drew closer, the bundle moved slightly, and he realized with a jolt that it was a person. He urged his horse forward, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle at his saddle, though he sensed no immediate danger. When he reached the figure, he dismounted quickly and knelt beside what he now saw was a woman, her dress torn and dusty, her dark hair tangled around her pale face. She was conscious but barely, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, her eyes unfocused as they tried to find his face. "Madam," Duncan said, his voice rough from his own thirst but filled with concern. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyes finally focused on him, and he saw they were a striking green, the color of new grass in spring. She tried to speak, but only a rasping sound came out. Duncan immediately grabbed his canteen and carefully lifted her head, bringing the water to her lips. She drank greedily at first, and he had to pull it back. "Slow now," he said gently. "Not too much at once or you'll be sick." She nodded weakly, and he let her have another small sip. As the water revived her somewhat, Duncan took stock of her condition. She was young, probably around 25, and though her face was sunburned and dirt-streaked, he could see she was beautiful. But more importantly, she looked like she'd been out here for at least a day, maybe more. Her dress, though torn and filthy, had once been of good quality. This was no frontier woman used to hardship. Someone had brought her out here and left her. The realization made anger flare hot in Duncan's chest. What kind of monster would abandon a woman in the middle of nowhere? "Can you tell me your name?" he asked, brushing some of the hair back from her face with surprising gentleness for a man with such calloused hands. "Josephine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Josephine Davis." "I'm Duncan Everett," he said. "I'm going to get you to safety, Miss Davis. Can you tell me what happened?" "Who left you here?" At his question, her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her dirty cheeks, leaving clean tracks in their wake. She turned her face away from him, her whole body beginning to shake with silent sobs. Duncan felt helpless in the face of her anguish, but he knew he needed to get her out of the sun and get some proper food and water into her before she could tell him anything. "It's all right," he said softly. "You don't have to talk about it now. Let's just get you somewhere safe." He looked around, assessing the situation. His camp was about 3 miles back, near a creek where he'd left his small herd to graze. It wasn't much, just a bedroll and a fire pit, but it had water and shade from the few cottonwood trees that grew along the creek bank. He couldn't take her all the way to Twin Falls, not yet. She was too weak, and the town was still 4 days' ride away. Duncan carefully lifted Josephine into his arms, surprised by how light she was. She couldn't have been out here eating or drinking much, if anything at all. She didn't protest, simply let her head rest against his chest as he carried her to his horse. Getting her into the saddle was tricky, but he managed to lift her up and then swing up behind her, holding her securely against him as he turned the horse back toward his camp. As they rode, Duncan could feel every shudder that went through her body, could hear the occasional soft sob that escaped despite what seemed like her best efforts to contain them. He found himself murmuring reassurances, things he'd heard his mother say long ago when he was a boy and had taken a fall or scraped his knee. It seemed to help, because gradually Josephine's breathing steadied and her body relaxed slightly against his. When they reached his camp, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Duncan's small herd of about 30 cattle were grazing peacefully near the creek, watched over by his dog, a black and white border collie named Scout, who came running up as they approached, tail wagging. Duncan dismounted and carefully helped Josephine down, then guided her to sit on his bedroll, which he'd spread under the largest cottonwood. Scout sniffed at her curiously before lying down nearby, as if sensing she needed protection. "I'm going to make a fire and get some food cooking," Duncan said. "There's more water in that canteen there. Drink it slowly, remember. I'll fetch more from the creek in a bit." Josephine nodded, reaching for the canteen with trembling hands. As Duncan built up the fire and set about making a simple stew from the dried meat and beans he carried in his saddlebags, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She drank the water in small sips, then simply sat staring at the flames as they grew, her expression empty and lost. Duncan Everett was 32 years old, and he'd been working cattle and horses since he was tall enough to climb into a saddle. His father had owned a ranch near Omaha, but when both his parents died of influenza 5 years back, Duncan had sold the place. He couldn't bear to stay there without them, surrounded by memories. Since then, he'd been drifting, taking work where he could find it, building up small herds and selling them, never staying in one place too long. He was tall and lean, his face weathered from years in the sun, his dark hair usually in need of a cut, and his blue eyes held a quiet sadness that matched the loneliness of the prairie itself. He'd had a woman once, back before his parents died. Her name was Margaret, and they'd planned to marry. But after the ranch was sold and Duncan started drifting, she'd married someone else, someone who could offer her stability and a home. Duncan didn't blame her. He knew he wasn't the settling kind, at least not anymore. The prairie had gotten into his blood, and the thought of being tied down to one place made him feel like he couldn't breathe. But seeing Josephine sitting there, so broken and lost, stirred something in him that he'd thought was long dead. A protective instinct, maybe, or just basic human decency. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't just take her to the nearest town and leave her. He needed to know she'd be all right, that whoever had done this to her would face justice. As the stew began to bubble over the fire, filling the air with a savory smell, Duncan dished some into a tin bowl and brought it to Josephine along with a spoon. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it'll put some strength back into you." She took the bowl with both hands, looking up at him with those green eyes, and for the first time she spoke more than a single word. "Thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "You saved my life. I thought I was going to die out there." Duncan settled himself on the ground across from her, his own bowl of stew in hand. "Who left you there, Miss Davis?" Josephine's hands tightened on the bowl, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She set the bowl aside, clearly unable to eat while talking about whatever had happened. "My husband," she said bitterly. "My husband and his brother. They brought me out here yesterday morning in the wagon. Thomas said I was worthless to him, that I'd failed in my most basic duty as a wife. So he decided he didn't want me anymore." Duncan felt the anger return, hotter this time. "Failed how? What duty?" Josephine looked down at her hands, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I can't have children. We'd been married for 3 years and I never conceived. Thomas took me to a doctor in Omaha 6 months ago. The doctor said there was something wrong with me inside, that I'd never be able to bear children." She looked up at Duncan, her face twisted with pain. "Thomas said what good was a wife who couldn't give him sons? His brother Albert agreed. They said I was just eating food and taking up space. So they brought me out here, gave me one canteen of water and left me. Thomas said if God wanted me to live, someone would find me. If not, then it was his will that I die. Duncan had heard of such things happening, though never witnessed it firsthand. In these harsh times, children were seen as necessary, as workers, and as a legacy. But to abandon a woman to die because of something she had no control over struck him as one of the cruelest things he'd ever heard. "Where's he from, this husband of yours?" Duncan asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We had a homestead about 20 miles northwest of here," Josephine said, "near a settlement called Broken Bow. But Thomas told me before he left that he was going to tell everyone I'd run off with a traveling salesman. He said no one would believe me if I tried to come back and tell the truth. He said his brother would back up his story, and I had no one else, no family." "No family at all?" Duncan asked. Josephine shook her head. "My parents died of cholera when I was 16. I was living with a family in Omaha, working as a housekeeper when I met Thomas. He seemed kind then, attentive. He courted me properly, and when he asked me to marry him, I thought it was the answer to my prayers. A home, a husband, a future." Her laugh was bitter. "I didn't realize that future was conditional on something I couldn't control." Duncan set his bowl aside, no longer hungry. "You eat that stew," he said firmly. "Get your strength back, and then we'll figure out what to do next." "What can I do?" Josephine asked, her voice breaking. "I have nothing. I am nothing. Even the law won't care about a barren woman abandoned by her husband. He has every right to cast me out, according to most people's thinking." "That's not true," Duncan said, though he knew that legally she might be right. The law often sided with husbands, especially in matters of marriage. "And you're not nothing. You hear me? What happened to you is a crime, pure and simple. A man doesn't get to leave his wife to die just because she can't have children." Josephine looked at him with something like hope flickering in her eyes, but it died quickly. "Even if that's true, what can I do about it? I have no money, no way to survive on my own. I don't even have any possessions except this torn dress." Duncan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "First, you eat and rest. Tomorrow we'll head toward Twin Falls. I have some money from my last cattle sale, enough to get you set up somewhere, maybe help you find work. You can start over, build a new life away from that bastard husband of yours." "Why would you help me?" Josephine asked, her eyes searching his face. "You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. You're a person in need," Duncan said simply. "That's enough." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle the only sounds. Josephine eventually picked up her bowl and ate the stew slowly, and Duncan could see color beginning to return to her cheeks. As night fell and the stars came out in their thousands, Duncan gave Josephine his bedroll and blanket, insisting despite her protests. He made himself comfortable by the fire with his saddle as a pillow and his coat as a blanket, Scout curled up beside him. Before she fell asleep, Josephine spoke one more time. "Mr. Everett?" "Yes, madam. Thank you. Truly, I won't forget this kindness." "You're welcome, Miss Davis. Now get some rest." Duncan lay awake for a long time, staring up at the stars and thinking about Josephine's situation. He'd meant what he said about helping her get settled in Twin Falls, but the more he thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. A woman alone in a frontier town, with no family and no husband, would have limited options. She could maybe find work as a housekeeper or a cook, but it would be hard work for little pay, and she'd always be vulnerable to men who might take advantage of her situation. An idea began to form in his mind, one that surprised him with its boldness. But the more he considered it, the more sense it made. He'd think on it more in the morning, he decided. For now, he needed to sleep. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a hint of the autumn that was coming. Duncan woke to find Josephine already up, sitting by the creek and washing her face and hands in the cold water. Scout was with her, and she was talking softly to the dog, who sat listening with his head tilted as if he understood every word. Duncan started the fire again and made coffee and cornmeal mush for breakfast. When Josephine returned, he saw that she'd done her best to clean herself up and had braided her long dark hair. Even with her torn and dirty dress, she looked better, stronger. Over breakfast, Duncan laid out his idea. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, "and I have a proposition for you if you'll hear it." Josephine looked at him warily. "What kind of proposition?" "A practical one," Duncan said. "You need protection, a name, a way to make a life. I could offer you those things." "I don't understand," Josephine said. Duncan took a breath. "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me." Josephine's eyes went wide with shock. She set down her coffee cup carefully, as if afraid she might drop it. "Marry you? But you don't even know me. We only met yesterday." "I know enough," Duncan said. "I know you're a good woman who's been dealt a bad hand. I know you're brave because you survived out there alone, and I know you need help." "But what would you get out of it?" Josephine asked, her voice suspicious now. "You said yourself I can't have children." "Isn't that what all men want from a wife?" Duncan shook his head. "I've never had much desire for children. My life is out here, on the move, following the cattle. That's no life for raising a family anyway." He paused, trying to find the right words. "I'm not looking for a traditional marriage, Miss Davis. I'm 32 years old and I've made my peace with being alone. But I need help with the cattle, with the camp. And you need protection and a name. It could be a partnership, nothing more. We'd both benefit." Josephine stared at him for a long moment. "A partnership? You mean a marriage in name only?" "If that's what you want," Duncan said, "I won't make any demands on you that you're not willing to give. You'd have your own space, your own life. But you'd have the protection of my name, and the law couldn't touch you for leaving your husband if you're married to someone else." "Can I even do that?" Josephine asked. "Marry someone else while I'm still married to Thomas?" "Your husband abandoned you and left you to die," Duncan said. "Far as I'm concerned, that marriage ended the moment he drove away. There are preachers out here who'll marry folks without asking too many questions, especially if we're in a different territory. And once we're married, if your husband ever tries to claim you back, he'd have to go through me." Josephine was quiet, clearly thinking hard. Duncan watched her face, saw the play of emotions there: fear, hope, doubt, and something else he couldn't quite name. Finally, she spoke. "Why are you really doing this? There has to be more to it than just needing help with cattle." Duncan considered his answer carefully. "Maybe it's because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said. "When my parents died, I lost my home, my purpose, everything I thought my life was going to be. I've been drifting ever since, and it's a lonely way to live. Maybe I'm tired of being alone, and maybe seeing you out there, abandoned and left to die, made me angry enough to want to do something about it. I can't change what happened to you, but I can offer you a way forward. That's all." Josephine's eyes were bright with tears, but she blinked them back. "If I agree to this, I want to be clear about the terms. You said it would be a partnership. That means I get a say in decisions, in where we go and what we do." "Fair enough," Duncan said. "And you said it would be a marriage in name only. You swear you won't force yourself on me, won't demand things I'm not ready to give?" "I swear it," Duncan said solemnly. "I'm not that kind of man, Miss Davis. You'll have your own bedroll, your own space. Anything beyond that would be entirely your choice." Josephine took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Everett, and thank you. I know this is strange and sudden, but I don't see that I have much choice. And truthfully, you seem like a good man. That's more than I can say for my first husband." Duncan felt an unexpected warmth in his chest at her words. "Then it's settled. We'll drive the herd to Twin Falls, sell them, and find a preacher to marry us. After that, we'll figure out what comes next." Over the next 4 days, as they made their way slowly toward Twin Falls with the cattle, Duncan and Josephine fell into an easy rhythm. She proved to be a quick learner, and though she'd never worked with cattle before, she wasn't afraid of the hard work. Duncan taught her how to ride properly, how to guide the cattle without spooking them, how to set up camp and cook over an open fire. In the evenings, after the cattle were settled and they'd eaten their simple dinners, they would sit by the fire and talk. Duncan found himself telling Josephine about his life, about growing up on the ranch, about his parents, and the woman he'd almost married. Josephine, in turn, told him about her childhood, about her parents and their small farm, about the dreams she'd had as a girl of seeing the world beyond Nebraska. "I used to read books," she said one night, her voice wistful. "My mother taught me to read, and whenever we'd go to town, I'd beg her to let me borrow books from the lending library. I'd read about Paris and London, about the ocean and mountains. I dreamed of traveling, of seeing those places." "And then you married Thomas," Duncan said. Josephine nodded. "I thought marriage would be my adventure. I thought building a life with someone would be exciting. But Thomas wasn't interested in dreams. He wanted a worker, someone to cook and clean and bear his children. When I couldn't do that last part, I became worthless to him." "You're not worthless," Duncan said firmly. "And who knows? Maybe after we're married and settled, we could do some traveling. I've always wanted to see the mountains myself, the real ones out west." Josephine looked at him with surprise. "You do that? Take me to see the mountains? Why not?" Duncan said with a small smile. "Like I said, it's a partnership. We should both get something out of it." As the days passed, Duncan found himself watching Josephine more and more. The way she laughed when Scout did something silly, the way she pushed her hair back from her face when she was concentrating, the way her whole face lit up when she successfully guided the cattle around an obstacle. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a strength in her, a resilience that he admired deeply. And if he was honest with himself, he was starting to feel things for her that went beyond simple partnership or friendship. But he'd made her a promise, and he intended to keep it. She'd been hurt enough by men who only saw her as a means to an end. He wouldn't be another one of those men. They reached Twin Falls on a crisp afternoon in late September. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a church, a small hotel, and various other shops and businesses. The cattle pens on the edge of town were busy with other ranchers bringing in their herds before winter. Duncan sold his cattle to a buyer he'd worked with before, getting a fair price that would keep him and Josephine comfortable for several months. Then, with the money safely in his pocket, he took Josephine to the general store and insisted she pick out some new clothes and supplies. "I can't let you spend all your money on me," Josephine protested as he piled items on the counter. 2 new dresses, a warm coat, boots, undergarments, a hairbrush, soap, and various other necessities. "It's our money now," Duncan said, "or it will be once we're married, and you need these things." No arguments. The woman running the store, a plump, friendly lady named Mrs. Patterson, smiled at them. "You two are getting married. How wonderful. When's the wedding?" "Soon as we can find a preacher," Duncan said. "Well, Reverend Mills over at the church would be happy to help you, I'm sure," Mrs. Patterson said. "He's performed many a wedding in this town, and if you need witnesses, my husband and I would be honored." "That's very kind of you, madam," Duncan said. After Josephine changed into one of her new dresses in the back room of the store, They walked together to the white church at the end of the main street. Josephine looked like a different person in the simple but well-made blue dress, her hair freshly brushed and shining in the afternoon sun. Duncan found it hard to look away from her. Reverend Mills was a kind-faced man in his 50s who asked them a few gentle questions about their intentions, but didn't pry too deeply into their circumstances. Duncan had worried that he might refuse to marry them without more information about Josephine's previous marriage, but the Reverend seemed to sense that there was a story there better left unspoken. "Love and commitment take many forms," he said quietly. "And if you two are committed to building a life together, then I'll be happy to unite you in marriage. Shall we say tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow would be perfect," Duncan said, glancing at Josephine, who nodded. That night they stayed at the small hotel in Twin Falls in separate rooms. Duncan lay awake for a long time, thinking about what he was about to do. He was getting married. It seemed unreal, especially since just a week ago he'd been alone on the prairie, planning nothing more complicated than selling his cattle and moving on to the next job. But now everything had changed. Tomorrow he'd have a wife, a partner. The thought should have terrified him, should have sent him running in the opposite direction. Instead, he found himself looking forward to it, to having Josephine by his side, to building something together. The next morning, Duncan put on his best shirt and jacket, the ones he usually only wore to funerals or important business meetings. He met Josephine in the lobby of the hotel, and his breath caught when he saw her. She was wearing the other new dress, a soft green that matched her eyes and Mrs. Patterson from the general store had lent her a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers. They walked together to the church, where Reverend Mills and Mr. and Mrs. Patterson were waiting. The ceremony was simple and short, but Duncan found himself moved by the words, by the gravity of the promises they were making to each other. When the Reverend told him he could kiss his bride, Duncan hesitated, not wanting to overstep the boundaries they'd established. But Josephine surprised him by leaning in and pressing a soft, brief kiss to his lips. It was over in a moment, but Duncan felt the warmth of it spread through his entire body. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Mills said with a warm smile. After the ceremony, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson insisted on treating them to lunch at the hotel restaurant, a celebration of sorts. Over roast chicken and potatoes, Mrs. Patterson chatted happily about the town, about the various people who lived there, about the community dances they held once a month in the church hall. "You should consider staying here in Twin Falls," she said. "We could use more good people like you. There's land available for homesteading and the town is growing. You could build a real future here." Duncan glanced at Josephine, trying to gauge her reaction. She met his eyes and gave a small shrug, leaving the decision to him. "We'll think about it," Duncan said. "I've been drifting for a long time. Might be nice to put down roots somewhere." After lunch, Duncan and Josephine walked around the town, Scout trotting along beside them. They looked at the available land on the outskirts of Twin Falls, surveyed the growing community, and talked about possibilities. "What do you think?" Duncan asked as they stood on a small rise overlooking the town. "Could you see yourself living here?" Josephine was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon. "I never thought I'd want to settle in one place again after what happened with Thomas, but this feels different. Twin Falls feels like a place where we could start fresh, where no one knows our story and no one will judge us for it." "Then we'll stay," Duncan said decisively. "I'll file for a homestead claim tomorrow. We can build a house, start a small ranch. It won't be easy, but we'll make it work." Josephine turned to him, her eyes shining. "Are you sure? You said you liked to drift, that you couldn't stand to be tied down." Duncan looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that something had shifted in him over the past week. I thought I needed to keep moving to escape the past, he said slowly. But maybe what I really needed was a reason to stop. And you're that reason, Josephine. You and the life we could build together. Josephine's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. I don't know what I did to deserve someone like you, Duncan Everett, but I'm grateful, so very grateful. They stood there together, watching the sun begin its descent, and for the first time in years, Duncan felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope. The next few months passed in a blur of hard work and new experiences. Duncan filed his homestead claim on 160 acres of good land just outside Twin Falls, near a creek that would provide water year-round. With the money from the cattle sale and some additional funds he'd been saving, he purchased lumber and supplies to build a house. Josephine worked alongside him every day, learning carpentry skills she'd never imagined she'd need. Together, they built a small but sturdy cabin with 2 rooms, a main living area with a fireplace and kitchen space, and a smaller bedroom. Duncan insisted on building a second sleeping area in the loft above the main room, maintaining the separate spaces they'd agreed upon. But as the weeks passed, and they worked side by side, something began to change between them. The partnership they'd agreed to was developing into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Duncan found himself looking for excuses to be near Josephine, to make her laugh, to see her smile. And Josephine, for her part, seemed to seek out his company just as much. One evening in early November, as they sat by the fire in their newly completed cabin, Josephine spoke about something that had clearly been on her mind. "Duncan, can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, looking up from the piece of leather he'd been working on. "Are you happy?" "With this arrangement, I mean. With me?" Duncan set aside his work and gave her his full attention. "I'm happier than I've been in years, Josephine. Why do you ask?" She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "Because I worry sometimes that you regret this, that you feel trapped. You gave up your freedom for me, and I'm not even a proper wife to you. I can't give you children, can't give you the things a real marriage would bring." Duncan moved from his chair to sit beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders were touching. "Josephine, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and he saw the vulnerability there, the fear of rejection that still haunted her from her first marriage. "You are my wife in every way that matters," Duncan said firmly. "You're my partner, my friend. We built this house together. We work this land together. You make me laugh, you make me think about the future in ways I haven't in years. That's more than enough for me. As for children, I meant what I said before. I never had a burning desire for them. If it happens, it happens. If not, then we'll fill our lives with other things. There's more than one way to build a meaningful life." "But what about the marriage itself?" Josephine asked softly. "The physical side of it. Don't you want more than just a partnership?" Duncan felt his heart begin to race. They were treading into territory they'd carefully avoided since their wedding day. "What I want," he said carefully, "is for you to be happy and to feel safe. I made you a promise that I wouldn't push you, and I intend to keep it. But I won't lie to you, Josephine. I've come to care for you deeply. More deeply than I expected to. If you're asking whether I'd want a real marriage in every sense of the word, then yes, I would. But only if that's what you want too." Josephine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then slowly, she reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "When Thomas touched me, it was always about what he wanted, what he needed," she said quietly. "It was never gentle, never caring. It was just another duty I had to perform. And when I couldn't give him children, even that became something he used to punish me with, to make me feel like I'd failed." Duncan squeezed her hand gently, anger at her former husband flaring in his chest once again. "But you're different," Josephine continued. Everything about you is different. The way you look at me, the way you treat me with respect and kindness. You make me feel valued, not for what I can give you, but just for being me." She took a shaky breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Duncan, and it terrifies me." Duncan felt something open up in his chest, a warmth that spread through his whole body. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I don't know how to be in love without being hurt," Josephine said, tears beginning to slip down her cheeks. "I don't know how to trust that you won't change, that you won't decide one day that I'm not enough." Duncan raised his free hand and gently wiped away her tears. "I can't promise that life will always be easy or that we'll never have hard times. But I can promise that I will never abandon you, never treat you as less than you are. And I can tell you that I'm falling in love with you too, Josephine. Maybe I have been since the day I found you on the prairie." Josephine let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "That's not very romantic, falling in love with a half-dead woman in the dirt." Duncan smiled. "I didn't fall in love with you because of how you looked that day. I fell in love with your strength, your courage, your determination to survive. And every day since then, I've found new reasons to love you more." Josephine looked at him with such tenderness that it took Duncan's breath away. Then, slowly, she leaned in and kissed him. Unlike the brief peck at their wedding, this kiss was deep and full of meaning, full of all the feelings they'd been holding back for months. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Josephine rested her forehead against Duncan's, her hand still clasped tightly in his. "I want this to be a real marriage," she whispered. "In every way, I want to share your bed, your life, everything. I'm ready, Duncan. I trust you." Duncan pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, making sure she was certain. What he saw there was not fear or obligation, but genuine desire and love. He stood, pulling her up with him, and led her toward the bedroom. That night, they became husband and wife in truth, and it was everything Josephine had never known marriage could be. Tender, patient, filled with genuine caring and connection. Duncan took his time, always checking to make sure she was comfortable, always putting her needs above his own. And Josephine, for the first time in her life, understood what it meant to be truly cherished. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Josephine felt tears sliding down her cheeks again. But these were tears of happiness, of relief, of coming home. "Thank you," she whispered into Duncan's chest. "For what?" he asked, his hand stroking her hair gently. "For showing me what love is supposed to be, for giving me a life worth living." Duncan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You gave me the same thing. We saved each other, Josephine." As winter settled over Twin Falls, Duncan and Josephine grew closer with each passing day. They worked together to prepare the homestead for the cold months ahead, stocking up on supplies, reinforcing the barn they'd built for the few animals they now owned, chopping wood for the fireplace. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Duncan would read aloud from the books Josephine borrowed from the small lending library that Mrs. Patterson had started in the general store. Sometimes they would just talk, sharing their thoughts and dreams, learning everything about each other. Josephine proved to be an excellent manager of their household finances, stretching every dollar and finding ways to make their homestead more efficient. Duncan, in turn, taught her everything he knew about ranching and livestock, treating her as a true equal partner in all their decisions. The people of Twin Falls welcomed them warmly. At the monthly community dances, Duncan and Josephine would dance together, and the townspeople would smile at how obviously in love they were. Mrs. Patterson became a good friend to Josephine, as did several other women in town. For the first time in years, Josephine felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had a community. One day in early December, As Josephine was helping Mrs. Patterson organize the lending library, the older woman brought up a subject that had clearly been on her mind. "Josephine, dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you and Duncan thought about starting a family?" Josephine felt the familiar pang of pain that always came with this question, but it was duller now, less sharp. She'd grown enough in her new life to face this topic without falling apart. "I can't have children," Josephine said quietly. "There's something wrong with me that prevents it." Mrs. Patterson's face filled with sympathy. "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. That must be difficult for you." "It was," Josephine admitted. "My first husband left me because of it. But Duncan doesn't mind. He married me knowing I couldn't give him children, and he's never made me feel less than whole because of it." "Duncan Everett is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "And you know, there are other ways to build a family if you ever wanted to. There are always children in need of homes, orphans, and such, but that's something to think about in the future if you choose. For now, just enjoy being newlyweds." Josephine smiled, grateful for the woman's kindness and understanding, but Mrs. Patterson's words stayed with her, and that evening she brought up the subject with Duncan as they prepared dinner together. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned something today about children who need homes," Josephine said, carefully chopping vegetables. "Orphans. I'd never really thought about that as a possibility before." Duncan looked up from the pot he was stirring. "Is that something you'd want, to take in orphan children?" "I don't know," Josephine said honestly. "I think I'm still healing from everything that happened with Thomas, from being told I was worthless because I couldn't have children. But maybe someday, when we're more settled, it could be something to consider, if you'd want that too." Duncan came over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I think that could be a beautiful thing, giving children who have nothing a home and a family, but you're right, there's no rush. We have time to think about it, to decide together when and if it's the right time." Spring came to Twin Falls with an explosion of green growth and wildflowers. Duncan and Josephine worked hard to plant their first crops and to expand their small herd of cattle. The work was grueling, but they did it together, and the sense of accomplishment they felt as they watched their homestead flourish was immense. One afternoon in late May, a stranger rode up to their property. He was a rough-looking man with hard eyes, and something about him immediately put Duncan on alert. He stepped out of the barn with his rifle in hand, not pointing it at the stranger but making its presence known. "Can I help you?" Duncan called out. The man looked around the property, his gaze lingering on Josephine, who had come out of the house at the sound of voices. "I'm looking for a woman named Josephine Davis. Heard she might be in these parts." Duncan felt Josephine go rigid beside him. He stepped slightly in front of her, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Who's asking?" "Name's Albert Davis," the man said, and Duncan felt his blood run cold. This was Thomas's brother, the one who'd helped abandon Josephine on the prairie. "I'm looking for my brother's wife. She ran off some months back, and he wants her back." "I'm not his wife anymore," Josephine said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear Duncan could see in her eyes. "I'm married to Duncan Everett now. I have the marriage certificate to prove it." Albert's face darkened. "You can't just marry someone else while you're already married. That's bigamy, and it's illegal." "Your brother abandoned me on the prairie to die," Josephine said, her voice growing stronger with anger. "He left me with no water, no food, no way to survive. That marriage ended the moment he drove away and left me there. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as God is concerned, I was a widow." "That's not how the law sees it," Albert said, "and Thomas wants what's his." Duncan raised the rifle now, pointing it directly at Albert. "You listen to me very carefully. Josephine is my wife now. legally married by a reverend in Twin Falls. If your brother has a problem with that, he can take it up with the law. But let me tell you what will happen if he does. I'll tell the sheriff exactly what he did, how he tried to murder his wife by abandoning her on the prairie. I'll press charges, and I'll make sure everyone in this territory knows what kind of man Thomas Davis is." Albert's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but Duncan cocked his rifle, the sound loud in the quiet afternoon. "I wouldn't," Duncan said calmly. "We've got neighbors within shouting distance, and they'll all testify that you came here making threats. Now you can turn your horse around and ride out of here, and you can tell your brother to leave us alone. Or we can settle this right now, and I promise you won't like how that ends." For a long moment, Albert stared at Duncan, clearly weighing his options. Then, with a curse, he yanked his horse's reins and turned to leave. But before he rode off, he called back, "This isn't over. Thomas won't let this go." "Let him come," Duncan called back. "We'll be ready." After Albert disappeared over the horizon, Duncan lowered his rifle and turned to Josephine. She was shaking, her face pale, and he immediately pulled her into his arms. "It's all right," he murmured. "He's gone. You're safe." "What if he comes back?" Josephine whispered. "What if Thomas comes for me?" "Then we'll deal with it," Duncan said firmly. "Together. But I meant what I said. If he tries anything, I'll make sure he pays for what he did to you. You're not alone anymore, Josephine. You have me, and you have this whole community behind you." That evening, Duncan rode into town and spoke with the sheriff, a grizzled veteran of the frontier named Sheriff Coleman. He told him everything, about finding Josephine on the prairie, about her abandonment, about Albert's visit and his threats. Sheriff Coleman listened carefully, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. "That's attempted murder, plain and simple," he said when Duncan finished. "If this Thomas Davis shows up in Twin Falls, I'll arrest him on the spot. And you were right to warn off the brother. Men like that only understand force." "I'm worried he'll try to come after Josephine when I'm not around," Duncan admitted. "When I'm out working the far pastures or in town for supplies." "I'll spread the word to keep an eye out," Sheriff Coleman said, "and I'll make sure everyone knows that Mrs. Everett is under the law's protection. Anyone tries to harm her or take her against her will, they'll answer to me and every man in this town." True to his word, Sheriff Coleman made sure the whole town knew about the threat. The men of Twin Falls, many of whom had come to respect, and like Duncan and Josephine, made it clear that they wouldn't stand for anyone hurting one of their own. Mr. Patterson even organized an informal watch, with different men taking turns riding past the Everett homestead throughout the day, just to make sure everything was all right. The community's support meant the world to Josephine. She'd never had this before, people who cared about her well-being not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It helped ease her fear, though she still sometimes woke in the night from dreams of Thomas finding her, of being dragged back to that life of misery and worthlessness. But Duncan was always there in those dark moments, holding her, reminding her that she was safe, that he would never let anyone hurt her. And gradually, as weeks passed and Thomas didn't appear, Josephine began to relax again, to believe that maybe her past truly was behind her. Summer brought its own challenges and joys. The crops grew well, and Duncan's small herd had increased with several new calves. Josephine started a vegetable garden that flourished under her careful attention, and she began selling her excess produce at the general store, earning her own money for the first time in her life. One hot July afternoon, Josephine was in town making a delivery to the general store when Mrs. Patterson pulled her aside with an urgent expression. "Josephine, there's something I need to tell you," the older woman said quietly. "There's a family passing through town, heading west. They have 4 children with them, but 3 of those children aren't theirs. The parents died of fever a few weeks back, and this family took in the orphans because there was no one else. But they're struggling, Josephine. They barely have enough to feed their own child, let alone 3 more. They've been asking around, trying to find families who might be willing to take 1 or more of the children. Josephine felt her heart clench. How old are the children? 2 boys and a girl, Mrs. Patterson said. The oldest boy is about 10, I'd say. The younger boy is maybe 7. And the little girl is just a baby, barely a year old. Without thinking, Josephine said, "Where are they? Can I meet them?" Mrs. Patterson led her to the small church, where the family was resting in the shade. The children were immediately visible. 2 thin, scared-looking boys in clothes that were too small, and a baby girl with wide brown eyes and wispy blonde hair, being held by a tired-looking woman who was clearly at the end of her rope. When the baby saw Josephine, she reached out her chubby arms, and without hesitation, Josephine took her. The little girl settled against her immediately, as if she'd been waiting for Josephine all along. "What's her name?" Josephine asked, unable to take her eyes off the child. "Her mama called her Emma," the woman said. "Emma Foster, though she's too young to know her own name yet. Poor little thing. She was barely walking when the fever took her parents. We've done our best, but we just can't manage all 3 children. We're heading to Oregon to join my husband's brother, and we're already going to be a burden on them with our own boy." Josephine looked at the 2 older boys, who were watching her with a mixture of hope and resignation, as if they were used to disappointment. "And the boys?" "That's Henry and that's Peter," the woman said, pointing to each in turn. "They're good boys, hard workers. Their father was a blacksmith. They know how to work leather and metal, how to help with livestock. They're not trouble, just hungry and scared." Josephine felt tears pricking her eyes. She looked down at little Emma, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and felt something shift in her heart. This was what Mrs. Patterson had been talking about months ago. This was another way to build a family. "I need to talk to my husband," Josephine said. "Can you wait here? Please don't leave town until I come back." The woman nodded, relief evident in her face. "We'll wait, madam, and thank you for even considering it." Josephine rode home faster than was probably safe, little Emma wrapped securely in her arms. When she reached the homestead, Duncan was working on fixing a section of fence. He looked up in surprise when he saw her approaching with a baby. "Josephine, what's happened?" Josephine dismounted awkwardly, trying not to jostle Emma, and rushed over to him. The words tumbled out of her as she explained about the orphan children, about the family that couldn't care for them, about how Emma had reached for her, and how her heart had broken for those 2 little boys watching with such hopeless eyes. "I know we talked about maybe taking in children someday," Josephine said breathlessly, "but I think someday is now, Duncan. I think we're meant to help these children. At least Emma, if not the boys too. I know it's sudden, and I know it's a lot to ask, but please, can we at least consider it?" Duncan looked at the sleeping baby in Josephine's arms, then at his wife's face, so full of hope and love and desperate pleading. He thought about the house they'd built, the land they'd claimed, the life they were creating together. It was a good life, a stable life. They had room for children, and they certainly had love to give. "Tell me about the boys again," he said. Hope flared bright in Josephine's eyes as she described Henry and Peter, their ages, what the woman had said about their skills and their characters. Duncan listened carefully, his practical mind already working through the logistics. 3 children would be a lot to take on all at once, especially when they'd never parented before. But they also had a working homestead that could use the help of 2 strong boys, and Josephine clearly had already bonded with the baby. "All right," Duncan said finally, and Josephine let out a cry of joy. "Let's go meet these boys and make sure they're willing to come with us. I won't force any child to live somewhere they don't want to be, but if they're agreeable, then we'll take all three. We're not splitting up a family if we can help it." Josephine threw her free arm around Duncan's neck, kissing him soundly. Thank you so much. You won't regret this, I promise." They rode back to town together, and Duncan met Henry and Peter. The boys were wary at first, clearly used to being disappointed by adults. But when Duncan spoke to them honestly about what life on the homestead would be like, the hard work but also the fair treatment, the education they'd receive, the home they'd have, something in their faces began to change. "You mean we'd all three stay together?" Henry asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Emma too, Duncan confirmed. "If you're willing to work hard and be part of our family, then yes, you'd all stay together." The boys looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Then Henry, clearly the spokesman, turned back to Duncan and Josephine. "We'll work hard, sir, we promise. We'll earn our keep." "You'll work, yes," Duncan said, "but you're not earning your keep like hired hands. You're family now. That means you work because we all work together to make the homestead succeed. It also means you go to school, you play, you have time to be children." "Understood," both boys nodded, tears streaming down their faces now. Peter, the younger one, ran to Josephine and wrapped his arms around her waist, careful not to crush baby Emma. "Thank you," he sobbed. "Thank you for not making us split up." And just like that, Duncan and Josephine's family grew from 2 to 5. The next few months were chaotic and challenging, and more rewarding than Josephine had ever imagined possible. The boys settled in quickly, grateful for regular meals and a warm, safe place to sleep. Henry proved to be intelligent and eager to learn, and Duncan began teaching him not just about ranching but also about reading and writing, skills the boy had never had the chance to fully develop. Peter was quieter but just as hardworking, and he had a natural way with animals that made him invaluable around the homestead. Emma, as Josephine had known from the moment the baby reached for her, was pure joy. She was a happy child despite losing her parents, and she attached herself to Josephine with complete trust and love. Josephine found herself amazed by the depth of feeling she had for this little girl who wasn't hers by birth, but was absolutely hers by choice and by love. Duncan, too, surprised himself with how naturally fatherhood came to him. He was patient with the boys, teaching them everything he knew, treating them with the same respect and kindness he showed Josephine. And with Emma, he was unexpectedly tender, letting the little girl wrap him around her tiny finger, carrying her around on his shoulders, making silly faces to hear her laugh. One evening in October, after the children were all asleep, Josephine and Duncan sat on the porch they'd built that summer, watching the stars come out. Josephine was leaning against Duncan, his arm around her shoulders, both of them tired but content. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if you hadn't found me on the prairie that day?" Josephine asked quietly. Duncan was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "I'd probably still be drifting, selling cattle, moving from place to place alone. And you'd be—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bear to think about what would have happened to Josephine if he hadn't found her in time. "I'd be dead," Josephine said matter-of-factly. "I was so close to giving up when you found me. Another few hours and I wouldn't have had the strength to drink even if you'd offered water. Thomas and Albert left me there to die, and I would have if not for you. Then I'm grateful every day that I decided to ride that particular direction," Duncan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Because finding you, building this life with you, becoming a family with these children, It's been the best year of my life, Josephine. You saved me just as much as I saved you. How did I save you? Josephine asked, turning to look up at him. You gave me a reason to stop running from my past and start building a future, Duncan said. You gave me purpose and love and a home, not just a house, but a real home. I didn't even realize how much I needed that until I had it. Josephine reached up and cupped his face, pulling him down for a kiss that was full of tenderness and love. I love you, Duncan Everett, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. I love you too, Duncan said. More than words can say. Winter came again, their second winter together, but this time the cabin was full of warmth and noise and life. The children thrived under Duncan and Josephine's care. Henry shot up several inches, filling out from the skinny, half-starved boy they'd first met. Peter's quiet nature began to open up as he learned to trust that this home was permanent, that Duncan and Josephine weren't going to send them away. And Emma grew from a baby into a toddler, taking her first steps, saying her first words, calling Josephine and Duncan Mama and Papa in her sweet, high voice. The threat from Thomas Davis never materialized. Sheriff Coleman received word through his network of lawmen that Thomas had headed west to California, apparently deciding that chasing after Josephine wasn't worth the trouble. Albert hadn't been seen in the area since his confrontation with Duncan. Gradually, Josephine let go of the last of her fear, truly believing that her past was behind her. In the spring, on the first anniversary of when Duncan had found Josephine on the prairie, they took the children on a picnic to a beautiful spot by the creek. As they sat watching Henry and Peter skip stones and Emma toddle around picking wildflowers, Duncan put his arm around Josephine. "Happy anniversary," he said softly. Josephine smiled. "Is that what we're calling it, our anniversary?" "Why not?" Duncan said. "It's the day our life together really began. Everything else came from that moment." "Then happy anniversary," Josephine said, leaning into him. "And thank you for the 1,000th time for saving my life that day." "You know," Duncan said thoughtfully, "I used to think I saved you. But the more time passes, the more I realize we saved each other. You gave my life meaning again, Josephine. You and these children, this homestead, this family we've built. I was just surviving before. Now I'm living." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "We were both lost," she said. "And we found each other. And then we found these beautiful children who needed us as much as we needed them. It's like everything that happened, all the pain and loss, it led us exactly where we were meant to be." "Do you ever think about Thomas anymore?" Duncan asked carefully. "About what he took from you?" Josephine considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with pain anymore. Mostly I just feel grateful that he abandoned me, because otherwise I never would have found you. I never would have learned what real love feels like, what it means to be valued for who I am rather than what I can provide. Thomas thought he was punishing me by leaving me on the prairie, but really, he was setting me free." Duncan pulled her closer. "I'm glad you see it that way. Because you are free, Josephine. Free to be yourself, to live the life you choose, to love and be loved. And I promise you, for as long as I live, I will make sure you never forget how valuable and cherished you are." "I know," Josephine said simply. "You show me every day." They sat together, watching their children play until Emma toddled over and demanded to be picked up. Duncan scooped her into his arms, making her giggle, and Josephine felt her heart swell with so much love she thought it might burst. That night, after the children were in bed, Josephine had news to share with Duncan. She'd been feeling strange for a few weeks now, tired and queasy in the mornings. She dismissed it at first, thinking perhaps she was just working too hard. But then she'd missed her monthly courses, and a suspicion had begun to form. That afternoon, while in town for supplies, She'd spoken quietly with Doc Harrison, the town's physician. He'd examined her and confirmed what she'd barely dared to hope. Despite what the doctor in Omaha had told her years ago, despite Thomas's insistence that she was barren, she was with child. "Duncan," she said as they prepared for bed, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, immediately sensing the gravity in her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," Josephine said, a smile breaking across her face. "Something is very, very right. Duncan, I'm pregnant. I'm going to have a baby." Duncan stared at her for a long moment, clearly shocked. "But I thought you said you couldn't have children. That doctor in Omaha said it was impossible." "I thought so too," Josephine said. "But Doc Harrison confirmed it this afternoon. I'm about 2 months along, he thinks. Maybe that doctor in Omaha was wrong, or maybe it's a miracle. I don't know and I don't care. All I know is that we're going to have a baby, Duncan. Our baby." Duncan let out a whoop of joy and swept Josephine into his arms, spinning her around before carefully setting her down, suddenly worried about being too rough. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Josephine asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Duncan said, cupping her face in his hands. "You've given me so much already, Josephine. A home, a family, a purpose. And now this. I don't have words for how blessed I feel." "I was so scared to hope," Josephine admitted. "After everything Thomas put me through, all those years of being told I was defective, broken. I was terrified to even consider that I might be pregnant, but Doc Harrison was certain. And Duncan, for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what this means. I'm not afraid of failing or of being judged, because I know that no matter what happens, you'll be there and you'll love me and this baby unconditionally. Always," Duncan promised. "Through everything, always." The news of the pregnancy spread through Twin Falls quickly, as news always did in small towns. The women of the community rallied around Josephine, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, sharing their own stories of motherhood. Mrs. Patterson was particularly delighted, immediately starting to knit baby blankets and booties. Henry and Peter were excited about having a baby brother or sister. And Emma, though she didn't fully understand what was happening, seemed to sense the joy in the household and was even more cheerful than usual. As Josephine's belly grew over the following months, Duncan became increasingly protective. He insisted she rest more, took on extra chores to lighten her load, and fussed over her in a way that was both endearing and occasionally exasperating. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," Josephine said one day as Duncan tried to prevent her from lifting a basket of laundry. "I know," Duncan said, "but humor me. I've never been a father to a baby before, not from the very start. I want to make sure I do everything right." Josephine softened at his words. "You're going to be an amazing father. You already are an amazing father to Henry and Peter and Emma. They came to us already able to walk and talk," Duncan pointed out. "This baby is going to be helpless and tiny, depending on us for everything. It's terrifying and wonderful all at once." "It is," Josephine agreed, "but we'll figure it out together just like we've figured out everything else." In late November, with winter closing in once again, Josephine went into labor. Doc Harrison had been staying in Twin Falls rather than making his usual circuit, specifically so he'd be available when the time came. Mrs. Patterson and 2 other experienced mothers came to help, shooing Duncan and the older boys out of the bedroom and putting them to work keeping Emma entertained and the fire stoked. Duncan paced in the main room, listening to Josephine's cries from behind the closed door, feeling completely helpless. Henry and Peter tried to distract him, and Emma, sensing the tension, clung to Duncan's leg. "She'll be all right, won't she?" Peter asked anxiously. Mrs. Everett is strong. She's the strongest person I know, Duncan said, trying to convince himself as much as the boys. She'll be fine. They'll both be fine. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Just when Duncan thought he couldn't stand another minute of waiting, another moment of hearing Josephine in pain, he heard a new sound, the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby. Duncan's heart leaped into his throat. A moment later, the bedroom door opened and Mrs. Patterson emerged, her face tired but wreathed in smiles. "Congratulations, Duncan," she said. "You have a healthy baby boy, and Josephine is doing wonderfully. She wants to see you." Duncan rushed into the bedroom, the boys and Emma following close behind. Josephine was propped up against pillows, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she saw Duncan, her face lit up even more. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Duncan approached the bed carefully, looking down at the tiny red face of his newborn son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small snuffling noises, his little fists waving in the air. "He's perfect," Duncan whispered, reaching out to touch one tiny hand. The baby immediately grasped his finger with surprising strength. "He is," Josephine agreed. "I was thinking we could name him Daniel. Daniel Everett. What do you think, Daniel?" Duncan repeated, testing the name. "I think it's perfect. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the family." Henry and Peter crowded around to see their new brother, and Duncan carefully lifted Emma up so she could see too. The little girl peered at the baby with wide eyes, then gently patted his head. "Baby," she announced proudly, as if she'd personally created him. Everyone laughed, and the sound filled the room with warmth and joy. Doc Harrison finished his examination of both mother and baby, pronounced them both healthy, and left with instructions for Josephine to rest as much as possible. Over the following days, Duncan discovered the reality of life with a newborn. Daniel was a good baby overall, but he woke frequently in the night to eat, and Duncan insisted on getting up with Josephine each time, fetching her water, changing Daniel's diapers, soothing him when he fussed. "You need your sleep," Josephine protested one night as Duncan lifted the crying baby from his cradle. "You have so much work to do during the day." "The work will be there whether I sleep or not," Duncan said. "But these early days with our son, they'll never come again. I want to be part of every moment I can." Josephine watched him walk around the room, gently bouncing Daniel and humming softly, and felt her love for him deepen even further. He'd been everything she could have hoped for as a husband, but seeing him as a father to their children, biological and adopted alike, showed her depths to his character she was still discovering. Winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and early mornings, of learning to manage a household with 4 children including a newborn, of watching Daniel grow and change each day. Henry and Peter were endlessly helpful, taking on extra chores without complaints so Josephine could focus on the baby. Emma was fascinated by her new brother, always wanting to help feed him or rock him or sing to him in her toddler voice. By the time spring arrived, Daniel was a chubby, happy baby who smiled and cooed at everyone he saw. The older children adored him, and Duncan spent every spare moment playing with him, talking to him, introducing him to the animals on the homestead. One warm April evening, as the family sat on the porch watching the sun set, Josephine looked around at her husband and children and felt a sense of peace and completeness she'd never imagined possible. "What are you thinking?" Duncan asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how different my life is now compared to 2 years ago," Josephine said. 2 years ago, I was in the worst moment of my life, abandoned and left to die, believing I was worthless and had nothing to offer the world. And now look at us. We have this beautiful family, this home, this life. We have everything that matters. Do you ever wish things had been different? Duncan asked. That you'd never married Thomas, never gone through all that pain? Josephine considered carefully. I wish I'd been spared the suffering, she said honestly. I wish I'd never felt that kind of cruelty and rejection. But if changing the past meant I never would have met you, never would have built this life with you, then no, I wouldn't change it. Because this, right here, right now, is exactly where I'm meant to be. Duncan leaned over and kissed her softly. I feel the same way. Every hard thing I went through, every loss and disappointment, it all led me to that exact spot on the prairie where I found you. And finding you led to all of this. Our family, our home, our future, it was all worth it. What do you think our future holds? Josephine asked. Where will we be in 5 years? 10, right here, Duncan said without hesitation. On this land, in this home, raising these children and maybe a few more if we're lucky. Growing old together, watching our children grow up and build lives of their own. Being part of the Twin Falls community, contributing something meaningful. That's my dream for the future. Mine too, Josephine said. I don't need grand adventures or riches, just this. Just us. As if to emphasize the point, Emma climbed into Josephine's lap and Daniel began to fuss until Duncan picked him up. Henry and Peter sat on the porch steps, arguing good-naturedly about who was better at skipping stones. Scout lay at Duncan's feet, tail thumping contentedly. This was family. This was home. This was the life that Josephine had been abandoned for being unable to create, but she'd created it anyway, in a way that was more beautiful and meaningful than anything she could have imagined. The years that followed were full of the normal joys and challenges of family life. Henry grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day running of the expanding ranch. He married at 22, a sweet girl from town named Sarah, and built a house on the far corner of the Everett property, staying close to the family that had taken him in. Peter discovered a talent for working with metal and apprenticed with the blacksmith in Twin Falls, though he visited the homestead often and always considered Duncan and Josephine his true parents. He never forgot that they'd kept the family together when others would have split them up. Emma grew into a beautiful, spirited young woman who inherited Josephine's strength and Duncan's kindness. She became a teacher in Twin Falls, educating the next generation of children, including her younger siblings, because Daniel wasn't the last child born to Duncan and Josephine. 2 years after his birth, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline. 3 years after that, another son they named James. The children filled the house with noise and laughter and occasional chaos, but Duncan and Josephine wouldn't have had it any other way. Thomas Davis became nothing more than a distant, unpleasant memory. Josephine heard through the network of frontier gossip that he'd remarried in California and had several children with his new wife. She felt nothing but pity for the woman who'd taken her place and gratitude that she'd escaped that life. As Duncan and Josephine grew older, their love only deepened. The passion of early romance matured into something richer and more enduring. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared experiences, genuine friendship, and unwavering commitment. They still sat on the porch on warm evenings, now watching grandchildren play in the yard, marveling at how their family had grown. On the 20th anniversary of the day Duncan had found Josephine on the prairie, the whole family gathered at the homestead for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled every corner of the house that Duncan and Josephine had built together. There was food and laughter and music, and as Duncan watched Josephine moving through the crowd, embracing her children and grandchildren, he marveled at the journey that had brought them here. Later, when the party had quieted and most of the family had gone home, Duncan and Josephine walked together to the creek where they'd camped that first night. They sat on the bank, watching the water flow by, their hands intertwined. 20 years, Josephine said softly. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago that you found me out there, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. I remember every detail of that day, Duncan said. The way the sun was beating down, how my throat was dry from thirst, the way I almost didn't see you there in the grass. How close we came to never meeting at all. But we did meet, Josephine said. And you saved my life in more ways than one. You didn't just save me from dying on the prairie, Duncan. You saved me from believing I was worthless, from thinking my value was tied to something I couldn't control. You showed me what real love looks like. You did the same for me, Duncan said. I was lost when I found you, Josephine. I was running from my past, from pain, from connection. You gave me a reason to stop running and start building. You gave me everything that matters. Josephine leaned her head on Duncan's shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek and the evening birds. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and golden in the setting sun, the same prairie where their story had begun. You think this is what happiness is? Josephine asked. This feeling of contentment, of knowing you're exactly where you belong. I think this is more than happiness, Duncan said. I think this is fulfillment. This is purpose. This is love that's been tested and proven true. This is a life well lived. Then we're very lucky, Josephine said. We are, Duncan agreed. We found each other against all odds, built a family, created a legacy. Not everyone gets that. As the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had watched over them that first night together, Duncan and Josephine walked hand in hand back to their home. The house was full of the sound of their remaining house guests settling in for the night, and as they paused at the door, Duncan pulled Josephine close. I love you, he said, as he had every day for 20 years. Today, tomorrow, and always. I love you too, Josephine replied, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. Thank you for finding me, Duncan. Thank you for seeing my worth when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for this beautiful life. Thank you for letting me save you, Duncan said. And for saving me right back. They stood there for a moment, holding each other under the vast Nebraska sky, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had built something extraordinary together. Their love story had started with abandonment and desperation, but it had become a testament to the power of kindness, compassion, and the courage to take a chance on another person. As they finally stepped inside their home, surrounded by the family they'd created and the life they'd built, Duncan and Josephine knew that they had found what so many people spend their whole lives searching for: true love, real partnership, and a place in the world where they truly belonged. The prairie had tried to take Josephine's life, but instead, it had given her everything. It had brought Duncan to her at exactly the right moment, and from that chance meeting had grown a love that would last the rest of their days and ripple through generations of children and grandchildren to come. Their story was far from unique in the Wild West, where people were constantly being tested and forged by hardship. But it was uniquely theirs, and it was a story of hope, resilience, and the transformative power of love. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best, that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, and that families are built not just through biology but through choice, commitment, and the daily decision to love and be loved. As the years continued to pass, and Duncan and Josephine grew old together, their story became a cherished part of Twin Falls history. The young people of the town would hear it and be inspired, learning that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that second chances were possible, and that the measure of a person wasn't in what they could produce but in who they were. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful day on the prairie, Duncan and Josephine would return to the spot where he'd found her. They'd stand there together, remembering the scared, broken woman and the lonely, drifting man they'd once been, and they'd give thanks for the twist of fate that had brought them together. They'd remember that love had saved them both, and they'd renew their commitment to each other and to the family they'd built. Their legacy lived on not just in their children and grandchildren, but in the example they set for their community. They showed that marriage could be a partnership of equals, that children didn't need to be born to you to be loved as your own, that redemption and new beginnings were always possible, and that the greatest treasures in life weren't land or money or status, but the people you loved and who loved you in return. Duncan Everett and Josephine Davis Everett lived long, full lives, surrounded by love and family until their final days. And when they were gone, the story of how they found each other on the vast Nebraska prairie, how they'd built a life and a family against all odds, was passed down through generations as a testament to the enduring power of love, hope, and the courage to start again.